tackling what may be emerging as one of the greatest hidden threats to your kids' health: pesticides in your food. The recent headlines about a major scientific study called into doubt everything you think you know about organic foods. The takeaway was that organic fruits and vegetables are not healthier than conventional fruits and vegetables, and therefore not worth the money. I am telling you today, the headlines got it wrong. The organic debate. We've discussed it for decades, and recently, it's dominated the news.
This new study out that shows there's really no difference between organic and conventional foods.
But still, the question remains, is eating organic food really better for your health? A new study out of Stanford University is sparking controversy and confusing many of you.
Researchers found no proof that eating this peach instead of this one will be any better for your health.
That four-year study shows organic does not mean healthier.
Researchers consulted more than 200 studies involving organic foods. Their conclusion, there is little evidence that going organic is much healthier for you. But there's a glaring catch. The study seemed to give more weight to the nutritional values of foods and not as much concern for the chemicals you consume when you eat conventional foods. So, what's the bottom line? So you're being told organic food is no more nutritious than conventional, and it's not worth your extra money. Well, I'm here to say that it is worth the investment. Why do I say that? Pesticides. And this pediatrician is angry, and he says you and your kids are victims of exposure to pesticides. Dr. Alan Green has devoted much of his career studying how the environment affects children's health. So, Dr. Green, what was your reaction when you first saw these headlines?
I was appalled when I saw the headlines. They are dangerously misleading in most of the reports that I saw. Organic food, by definition, is grown without the use of synthetic hormones, without irradiation, without antibiotics, without genetic engineering, and without toxic synthetic pesticides. The EPA has said that protecting our kids from toxic pesticides is one of its top priorities, and I agree. But the headlines focus on these minor nutritional differences and they gloss over this huge role of pesticides. Anything that is missing the pesticide conversation is doing a disservice to our kids.
So what are some real-world influences of having pesticides, especially in the lives of our kids? I mean, you're a clinician, so speak to it if you can about the kids in your practice.
So kids that we see all the time. So at real-world levels of pesticides that you find in kids, you see ADHD, something very common and troublesome to parents. You see memory problems of low IQ. You also see learning disabilities.
So I have a couple members of the audience that I wanted to ask about their response to the study. So Janine, I'd love to hear what you thought when you read those headlines. Did it confuse you?
It definitely confused me because it went against everything that I'd researched and known about organic foods being healthier and more nutritious for you, and it left me wondering and wanting to know more.
Why did you start buying organic produce? I gather you are normally using organic.
Yes, we do. We use organic and locally grown foods. We started doing it mostly because my daughter was always a very picky eater, but she was also prone to a lot of head colds and sniffles, and we knew we had to make some better choices for her in terms of her nutrition. So we started looking at organic, and we believed it was, without even doing too much research, we believed it was more nutritious and more healthy and definitely better tasting. And she bought into it so much now that she has her own herb garden, and she helps us prepare our food now.
Good for her. How's she doing?
She's doing really well now. I've definitely seen over the last 3 years a great improvement in her health, and her immune system is extremely strong. She just started 6th grade. She hasn't been homesick from school since the beginning of 3rd grade. So I definitely attribute it to our overall organic diet.
Yeah, I see a lot of heads nodding in the audience. I mean, it is something that I hear about anecdotally. So if I can share with everybody, a landmark study just came out about 2 years ago with kids with ADHD. So Ginny, it's not exactly what your daughter had.
Right.
What they did is a government study. They tested the urine of these kids, and they found higher levels of pesticide residue. And those pesticides, the researchers concluded, probably came from food. So while you process that, let me turn to Diana. So Diana, you're generally, I understand, purchasing conventional products, not organic products for your family. How do you make that decision?
You know, pesticides are they're not something that are really on my radar. I take the kids food shopping. I need to go in, I need to get out. My focus is keeping them away from the sugary cereals and the fattening snacks. And honestly, pesticides, on the totem pole of things that I worry about for my family, pesticides are really, really low. quite frankly, I'm more concerned with bullies on the playground than I am with pesticides in my kids' food.
Well, it's a fair concern. I got to say, Dr. Green, there are probably a lot of folks watching now who say, what are you talking about? You're going to scare parents who don't have a lot of money, especially, from buying the fruits and vegetables and push them towards other stuff thinking there's no pesticides in that junk.
Yeah. I don't want to scare parents, but I do want to wake parents up. And I agree with Janine that getting them from sugary foods to fruits and vegetables is the huge, important first step. But organics is sometimes a great way to do that with the taste. But I'm not imagining from these pesticides that there's a new epidemic about to happen of bad stuff for our kids. What I'm saying is if you look at the way kids are today in the U.S., in some ways the healthiest ever, in other ways unhealthy in new ways, more chronic illnesses than ever, that if we get rid of the toxins, we have great potential for improving health. And just washing our fruits and vegetables isn't the answer. The pesticides get inside. So when you're choosing conventional, you're choosing often tiny, toxic hitchhikers with your food.
I mean, the government looks at these numbers. I'm sure there are many other experts who would argue that at the low levels of pesticides that we allow, could these really have a harmful effect?
I hear that argument all the time. The levels are so tiny, parts per million in the residues, parts per billion in our bodies, it couldn't possibly have an effect. I don't buy that. And here's why. When you look at our powerful medicines that we use to treat illness, they often work at parts per billion concentrations in our body. For instance, antidepressants in your brain, parts per billion, changes our behavior, changes our neurotransmitters. Why couldn't a pesticide do that?
So I'm left with the final issue that I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking through, which is cost. It's expensive. I mean, expensive enough that it becomes a major life changer for some families. So I was curious about this whole area. And so I wanted to see for myself if there's a difference in pesticide levels between organic and conventional produce. So we ran our own experiment. We enlisted a California lab specializing in pesticide residue on produce that's shipped across the country to conduct a definitive experiment. First, our producer collected the samples to be tested. 30 peaches and 6 bunches of celery, both organic and conventional. Then bagged, labeled, and dropped our samples at the lab to get the answers you need to protect your family's health. Here's what the lab found. We started with celery, just an example of what vegetables might be in our lives. We bought both organic and conventional celery, and we tested both for pesticides. In the organic celery, we found no detectable pesticide residue. In the conventional or non-organic celery, we found residues from 3 pesticides. 3 different types of pesticides were found, which means that these vegetables, even after being picked and shipped and processed, still had toxins in them, and you're bringing this into your home. Now, for fruits, we chose peaches, which is a notoriously dirty fruit. Means that pesticides get into it all the time. In the organic peaches, we found residue from 2 pesticides, but at very low levels. So it's still there, but very low levels. In the conventional peach sample, not organic, you guys ready for this? 7 pesticides. Residues from 7 pesticides. That means 7 different types of toxins were found in these peaches. So Dr. Green, analyze this for us. What does this mean?
Well, the results are clear. When you choose organic, you're choosing fewer pesticides. And your results are very consistent with what the USDA finds and other labs around the world find. Again and again, choosing organic, you get a smaller level of pesticides. And every bite of food that we eat is an investment in our bodies, or it's a debt we're taking out. We're going to have to repay somehow. And organic is a good investment when it comes to reducing pesticides.
How do you explain that there was still residue of 2 pesticides even in the organic peaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're there at very low levels for a couple of reasons. One is that there are some natural pesticides that are allowed in organic agriculture. But the other is that organic farms don't exist in isolation. The conventional farms that are around them will sometimes have pesticides that get into the air and drift or into the water. So organic is not part of the problem, it's part of the solution.
Now, I want to be clear about this. What I'm hearing from Dr. Green is that no matter what we eat, there's still a pretty good chance there's going to be some contamination of pesticides because we live in a globe that's all connected. I also want to be clear that the levels of pesticides we found in the food here, they tested below the levels that the government allows.
Right.
So that's okay. They're in the safe zone. key question is that good enough for you and your families? Dr. Green, your thoughts?
So I can't look a person in the eye and say that those levels are safe. We just don't know enough. At real world exposure levels, we have real health concerns and questions that are still out there. I think that some of the levels should be changed. And there's some pesticides, like the organophosphates, that I don't believe we need to be using anymore. Why add unnecessary toxins to the food that's becoming part of our bodies?
So, Diana, let me ask that question of you, if you don't mind. Earlier on, you said that pesticides weren't on your radar screen. Mm-hmm. How has this discussion influenced that radar screen image?
You know, I can't help but think that I grew up eating all the same fruits and vegetables that I'm feeding to my kids, and pesticides weren't an issue. And I grew up healthy and fine. So honestly, I may make some changes, but I'm probably not going to go radical and change my children's entire diet.
So I got to say, and then I'll speak to your point. As physicians, we just don't know.
Right.
You know, and I don't want to panic everybody, but we're at the very beginning of knowing the true health impact of these chemicals. And let me make this clear to everybody, for your kids. Their little bodies are developing very rapidly. There's some very tentative times there. Their livers, which is where all the detoxing occurs, are very sensitive, and they process toxins differently than adults. Their underdeveloped immune systems provide far less protection than an adult's immune system. And frankly, I'm worried about all their organs, but especially their brains, because they are vulnerable at this critical moment of growth at young age. So, Dr. Green, even the EPA is a moving target. They're changing their opinions of how much pesticide we can allow in our diet.
Yeah, the EPA is making this a major issue, and I'm really glad. They've already lowered the levels allowed on some pesticides, and I believe they'll push that bar forward. Pesticides may turn out to be the next lead. We used to all think when I was growing up that lead was fine, it wasn't affecting us. Then we learned it was affecting the brains, we got rid of it in gasoline, and everyone's IQ went up a little bit. I think we have potential for that.
Did it really?
Yeah.
Can you imagine that? I mean, making the kids dumb, maybe. Because of
Maybe.
pesticide exposure. Let me give you good news, because there are things you can do to make a difference. It turns out that kids who had previously had high levels of pesticide residue in their urine saw that level drop significantly after just 5 days of eating organic food. 5 days, folks. Well, while we're all figuring out the data, I think we've got some action steps. And I think your kids, all of our kids, deserve better than to be part of a national chemistry experiment. So I don't want anyone thinking that you need to eat less fruits and vegetables. We've made that point really clearly. But I do think you can get your kids to eat healthier one way or the other by choosing the right foods to make organic. So I'm saying it clearly now. I want you to eat organic foods. So we're going to start with one of my favorites. I want you to buy organic blueberries. And I got to say this, I never start a morning without blueberries. I eat a ton of them. And that's one of the reasons I think it should be the first thing on our list, because it's the first on my normal daily list of eating.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Whatever somebody's favorite food is, the fruit or vegetable they eat the most, that's a great place to start organic, because little amounts of the same pesticide over and over add up.
And why blueberries in general?
So blueberries in particular, in studies they've found evidence of one of those organophosphate pesticides linked to ADHD in 28% of samples of frozen blueberries.
You're kidding me.
Seriously.
Yeah. And it's also hard to get the pesticide residue off the blueberries, even by washing them?
It is. They tend to be in the berries. And so most of the pesticide levels, when they're tested, is after they've been washed or after they've been peeled.
So very high. All right, next I want you to buy organic peaches. Remember, I talked about peaches in that little study that I did. Why are peaches so susceptible to pesticides?
So peaches are sprayed when they're really young, really small, and their skin is very, very thin. So the pesticides get inside and stay there as the peach grows. So you can't wash it off of a peach. Some peaches have been found with 50 different pesticides in them.
I mean, how many pesticides are there? 50 is a lot.
Well, the test you did looked for 91 different pesticides. There's a lot of pesticides out there in our country.
And the last fruit that we want to recommend is strawberries. So why did you put strawberries on the list?
Well, strawberries are grown low to the ground, and so you have to be concerned about all the little bugs in the soil that can get on there. So they're often high amounts of pesticides put on. And their skin is also very thin, not quite as thin as the peaches. It doesn't absorb as much. But when we do go home and wash the strawberries, we don't tend to scrub as much because they're pretty fragile, so more stays on them.
And they're lower to the ground, I gather.
And they're lower to the ground.
So they tend to accumulate more pesticides for that reason as well. So those are the fruits. Let's switch now to vegetables. We're going to start with organic celery. Again, it was part of our trial. Why did you put that on the list?
Well, celery is consistently on the top list of most contaminated vegetables. And it's something, again, that doesn't have a skin. It soaks up the pesticides all the way through it. And there's often this rule of thumb. If it's thin skin, go organic. If it's a thick skin or a rind, you don't. Well, about half of that is right. The thin skin is more likely to get the pesticides, but some things with a thick skin, like a cantaloupe, for instance, imported cantaloupe, takes it up inside from the ground, from the roots, and ends up with very high levels of pesticides. So I wouldn't go too much by that rule of thumb.
Right. One big category is leafy greens.
Yes.
And you feel strongly they ought to be purchased organically.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing to purchase organically. You can often find really good deals on them. The leafy greens, lettuce, spinach, kale, that kind of thing. Again, it grows really close to the ground. The insects love to eat on those leaves, and so they get doused with lots of pesticides. They drink up that pesticide water. Great place to choose organic.
And the last item, and I was surprised by this one, but Dr. Green knows a lot about this, so I trust his judgment. You say we should be buying organic potatoes.
Yeah, potatoes are really high on my list, too, for a couple of reasons. One is that they are the most consumed vegetable in the U.S. We eat lots of potatoes, more than people think. But also, they're by themselves almost this little class in how pesticides end up in our food. So, potatoes, the soil is treated with insecticide before the potatoes are even planted to kill all the bugs in the soil. The seeds are soaked often in fungicides, some of the most toxic pesticides, to prevent blight later on. Then you got the whole bit where the crop is there and it gets treated with pesticides, which people know about. But the potato itself is part of the storage vessel of the plant, so it's all going inside the potato. Then, after you harvest it, they're treated again with fungicides, often to prevent sprouting down the road. So it's no wonder that potatoes end up consistently with among the highest levels of pesticides of any produce.
Well, you have convinced me. I don't know if you all feel the same way as I do, but it becomes difficult to imagine taking that chance, especially with the health of my kids.
And that's it. We don't know all the answers. So since there's a great alternative available, why not make our investment there?
Now, we reached out to the Alliance for Food and Farming. It's a nonprofit group of farmers across the U.S. And they said in part, I'm going to quote it, the use of pesticides on organic and conventional farms is stringently regulated by the EPA, the FDA, the USDA, as well as state and local regulatory authorities. Produce farmers work with these regulatory bodies to ensure responsible use of organic and conventional pesticides.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on new videos to live the good life.